morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. As Carrie-Anne said, my name is Laura Ung, and I'm an evaluation specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture and Irrigation in the Natural Resource Management branch. I've been leading the Environmentally Sustainable Agriculture Tracking Survey since 2010, along with an incredible group of subject matter and program experts. This survey has been supported by the ministry since before the turn of the century, with the first survey that is similar to what you'll be seeing today. It was conducted in 1997. Now, there are a couple of surveys prior to 97, but don't ask me about those because I was still in high school at the time. But my point is that we do have a rich history in the department and with our important industry stakeholders when it comes to tracking adoption of beneficial management practices used by Alberta producers. This survey is unique to Alberta, and there is no other province that has the same information that you'll be learning about shortly. So with that, I would like to introduce our webinar presenter for today, Chad Greenall. Chad is an Associate Vice President at Kynetec. He is responsible for market research being conducted in the Canadian agriculture market, including crops, crop protection and nutrition, sustainability, regulation and policy, farm equipment, and many more specific sectors. Chad fosters customer relationships with clients in these sectors and has been conducting both qualitative and quantitative research to meet their needs for over 20 years. And in that 20 years also includes the ESATS survey, which he's been working with since 2012. But prior to joining Kynetec, Chad gained valuable experience working for a major crop production manufacturer. He also earned a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture and with a major in crop protection from the University of Manitoba. So with nearly 30 years of agriculture industry experience, Chad brings a deep understanding of farm practice issues and challenges in Canadian agriculture. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Chad. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for the introduction, Laura. It's appreciated. And thank you to everyone on the call who is taking part in this presentation today. So today we are going to be going through some of the results from the environmentally sustainable agricultural tracking survey that we conducted this year. And we have 6 items on the agenda today. So we're going to start off by talking about giving a summary about the beneficial management practices, the adoption of those for soil, air, water, and biodiversity risk areas. We're going to look at those adoption of the practices by some respondent characteristics and producer profiles. We're going to develop a 4R nutrient management story from this data, looking at the adoption of the 4R nutrient management. And then we're going to talk a bit about carbon sequestration and emissions reduction. We're going to finish off the information with some information on the tools that are available for producers, and then have the Q&A session at the end for any questions that you might have. So jumping into the summary of the best management practices, the Environmental Sustainability Tracking Survey measures Alberta producers' awareness of and adoption of the environmental sustainable practices within the 4 areas that you see here: the water quality, soil health, biodiversity, and air quality. And the practices represented in each of those 4 groups really provide an indication on how the producers are doing at responsibly managing those corresponding natural resources. And so the numbers that you see in behind here are the number of measures that we have for each of the different risk areas. So we're going to start off by looking at the water quality risk area. And just to explain a little bit how this graph works, and because we're going to have a couple more that are like this, you'll see that the green bars are the eligibility bars. So what you see there are the percent of respondents who have been screened to determine that they are real candidates for adopting a specific BMP, and it's applicable for their operation. So in the case of avoiding storing manure near active water wells, there's 53%. If you don't have an active water well on your operation, you obviously can't adopt that practice. So that's why we look at eligibility criteria. For the blue bars, you can see that it's percentage of respondents who have adopted the practice. So taking that water well example, the 89% is of the 53% that are eligible to adopt that practice. And so that's how you read these particular charts. And so you can see that across the board, across the 7 practices that we're looking at, you've got fairly high adoption of the different practices. Avoiding applying compost to frozen or covered ground has the highest adoption, but it is a low eligibility criteria to get into that one. So if we quickly look at the 2021 survey results, you can see that the eligibility criteria is fairly consistent from year to year. There have been some changes in the adoption, particularly the one at the bottom, the avoid applying close to waterways to minimize increased nutrient runoff. You can see that the adoption score of that particular attribute has gone quite a bit up in the last 2 years. This chart is looking at the overall adoption that is happening with the water quality practices. And so the way this chart works is it's showing you the percent of the producers that have adopted what percent of the practices that they're eligible for. So I'll explain that a little bit more. So if you look at the top end, you'll see that, it says between 90 and 100%. So what that is of the practices that producers are eligible for, they are adopting between 90 and 100% of those practices. And you can see that 53% of the producers that we surveyed have adopted 100% of the practices that they're eligible for. And so that's how you read this chart. And then down at the lower end, you've got 12% having adopted none of the practices that they're currently eligible for. And then it's very polarized in the high end in terms of these results. So if you move on to the soil health best management practices, you can see here that the most adopted practice for this year is the frequency of manure application, that being that they apply manure less than 2 years or less when they make their manure application. And so you've got 81% of the producers saying that they meet that criteria of having applying manure every 2 years or less to their operation. And it works its way down through, reduced tillage at 57%. Manure application is based on P and or NNP, at 53. And use of pulse crop rotation is the lowest adoption on this soil health with a 28% adoption. If we bring in the 2021 results, you can see that the results are fairly consistent for the top attributes. We do have some growth in the adoption in the sampling and analyzing of manure for the nutrient content from 2021 to the 2023 study. If we look at the adoption chart again, you can see that the adoption of this one is more evenly spread out, with 15% of the producers saying that they have adopted 0% that they're eligible for, and a nearly equal amount saying that they've adopted all the practices that they're eligible for. And you've got the majority of producers in this range of 40 to 69.9%. You've got 50% of the producers in that range of that's how much they've adopted that they're eligible for the soil health measures. Moving to the biodiversity risk area, you can see that retaining bush and native grassland, as well as maintaining, enhancing, or restoring wetlands to the farm are the two that have the highest adoption for these measures. If we bring in the 2021 results, you'll notice that there has been a reduction in adoption for the top retaining of bush native grassland. And even though it appears that there's been a reduction for the maintaining and enhancing, we do need to note that we did change the wording of this question and the eligibility criteria for this question. So for the 2023 survey, so it makes the comparable a little bit difficult to do because of that changed wording. But you do see that we for the three practices underneath, there has been growth in adoption from 2021 to 2023. And if you see, as you can see in this slide, this one is more polarized in that you've got an even bigger proportion of the population saying that they've adopted none of the practices that they're eligible for, the 22%, and almost an equal number of producers, 23%, saying they've adopted all the practices that they're eligible for. If we move on to air quality, for this one, the most adopted is applying the chemical fertilizer at the recommended rate, and followed by incorporating manure after applying the manure. There are two practices down at the bottom that have 100% eligibility. They're trees for agricultural purposes and renewable power. Those are ones that every producer can technically do, but they do have a fairly low adoption rate of those two practices. And as you can see, those two practices, the adoption rate is fairly consistent with what we had in 2021. The first attribute, we also did have a wording and structure change to this question as well. And so the adoption rate increase from 2021 to 2023 needs to be, taken into that wording change needs to be taken into account when trying to do that comparison as well. So if you look at the distribution of the air quality adoption, this one is much lower in terms of the adoption. You don't have the higher end in terms of percentage of producers saying that they've adopted. You do have more down in this less than 30% kind of range. And that is really because those two attributes that I showed you, those two practices that we gave everyone 100% eligibility criteria, it's because of the low adoption scores in those that are driving this adoption overall down into the lower percentage areas. And if we look at kind of the trend that's been happening with the adoption scores across the four practices across the years from 2012 to 2023, you can see that the water quality has been very consistent in terms of the adoption score overall. This year's score is at a 76%. The biodiversity score has come down this year. It's down to 53. But again, we did have a wording change occur in the biodiversity attributes, so that needs to be taken into account. The soil health is at 49, and it's pretty consistent, around that 50 score mark throughout the years. And then the air quality is at 32 this year for its index score. And so again, we did have a change to the wording for that one, so that needs to be taken into consideration when looking at the trending results. If we look at the overall adoption of all the practices that producers are eligible for, so these are the 21 practices that we measured, and we look at the adoption that they have done, it becomes a more bell curve kind of shape. with the lower percentages on the two outside ends, and the majority of people being in the middle in terms of adopting 50%, 60% of the practices that they're eligible for. And if we look at the overall score for this year, the overall score is a 51. Again, fairly consistent with what it's been tracking at over the last years, taking into account those wording changes that we did when you look at the tracking. So that gets us through the looking at the summary of the practices. What we want to do next is we want to kind of look at how respondent characteristics can impact those practice adoption. So we're going to first start with the farm characteristics. And so region definitely is impacting adoption. The South Central and Peace generally outpace adoption compared to the other two regions. And where there's the biggest gap is in the soil health in practice areas. And that's where you can see that those regions do score higher. Air quality is the most evenly adopted across all the different regions. If we look at producer type, livestock-focused producers and mixed operations generally have higher ESA adoption scores compared to the crop-focused operations. And water quality adoption is lower among those crop operations, and air quality adoption is lower among livestock operations. And so there is a bit of a trade-off when it comes to producer type in terms of what the practices that they're adopting. If we look at the farm's gross farm revenue, those who earn over $1 million report higher adoption of both the air quality metrics and the soil health metrics. And farm status. So those planning to expand their operation had the highest adoption compared to those that are maintaining or reducing their operation. And they not only score higher on the ESA scores overall, but they also score higher in each of the 4 different areas that we looked at. So if we can move on to the actual producer characteristics now, how they impact it. So age, producers under 45 tend to have the highest adoption rates, while those over 65 tend to have lower adoption rates. Having an ag degree or diploma also impacts, where those respondents report higher adoption rates of the ESA score overall, a 58 versus a 48, but also the 3 practices of air, biodiversity, and soil. If we look at having an environmental farm plan, how that impacts, those with an environmental farm plan, not surprisingly, report higher adoption rates, both on the ESA score, but again on water, air, and soil. And then taking part in conservation training within the past 2 years, if the participants that did that report higher adoption rates both on the ESA score as well as water, air, and soil practice areas. And so you can see that there are some respondent and farm characteristics that do have impacts on those adoption of those BMPs. So that gets us through that. The next piece that we want to look at is the 4R fertilizer principles. And we're going to be looking at the 4R principles through the lens of high adoption for each of the 4R practices. First looking at fertilizer, then looking at manure. And the Alberta Agriculture and Irrigation team has come up with the criteria of what they consider to be high adoption using the questions that we had in the survey as the beginning point. So to start, like I said, we're starting with fertilizer. So looking at the right rate piece of the 4R, the 2 question areas that we're going to be looking at is factors determining application rates and the resources used for the decision making when it comes to fertilizer application. And so as you can see in the light beige box, the team has come up with the following to define the high adoption. And so producers who use soil or tissue tests, they are considered high adoption. So that's this first orange bar at 71%. So if you do that, you're considered a high adopter. If you are a producer who uses previous crop nutrient removal rates, you have to also be using the 4R nutrient stewardship principles and the AFFIRM program. And so if you do both those things, you are also considered a high adopter. And so if we push those together, what you get is that for the right rate fertilizer, we see that 71% of the producers would be considered a high adopter for right rate using this criteria. Moving on to right source. For right source, we're using the use of fertilizer blends, but also the use of nitrogen loss or improvement in efficiency products. And so again, looking at that light beige box down on the bottom, the criteria is producers who use a custom blend for each crop and field. So that's that, again, the dark orange bar, the 31%. Or if they use the custom fertilizer blends for each crop, then they also have to use the nitrogen loss reduction products either always or sometimes to then still be considered the high adopter for right source. And so if we do that, what we come to is that 49% of the fertilizer users in the study are considered to be high adopters for right source fertilizer. Right place, we're using the application methods and or variable rate technology for commercial fertilizers. And for this one, the criteria that the team came up with was the producer does any of the following. Whether they did any of the bright orange bars, they would be considered a high adopter for the practice. So is it in furrow, is it banded, is it fertigation down at the bottom, or did they use variable rate technology? And if we do that, we get 82% of the fertilizer users were considered high adopters for the right place. And then right time is the next one. This one is going to take a little bit. The first graph I'm showing you is the percentage of all fertilizer use at the different timings, the different seasons. So this is volume of fertilizer. So you can see that 93% of all the fertilizer used is being used in spring or summer. However, the high adoption criteria that was decided upon was a producer has to apply 0% of their fertilizer application during the fall or winter to be considered a right time high adopter. So what we did is we changed that into the percent of producers making an application in each of those times. So you can see the orange spring and summer. Those are what it would be considered high adopters, but it's really the gray attributes down at the bottom, the fall and the winter, where it's the opposite of those. So if they did a fall application or they did a winter application, they couldn't be considered a high adopter. And so if we look at that, then 80% of the users surveyed were considered to be high adopters for right time. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to bring the four pieces of the puzzle kind of all together to show you what does that mean in terms of high adoption of 1 through 4 of the 4R practices. So of the producers that we surveyed, 7% were doing one of the 4R practices. And here's how it breaks out, with right place being the most common. If they're going to do one of the 4Rs, right place is the one that they're most often using. We have 28% of the producers doing 2 of the 4. And the most common, again, was right time and right place. If we move to 3 practices, we've got 37% of the producers that would qualify as using 3 of the 4 for being high adopters. And you can see that it's right rate, right place, right time. right source is there, but less than the other three. And then for 4 practices, it's 27% of the producers are using all 4 of the 4R practices. And so all the bars would be 100% for this group. So you can see that that's how it breaks out for the adoption of the 4Rs, for being a high adopters. So if we move on and do the same practice through manure, for these ones, for manure, what we did is we're looking at manure application being based on the nitrogen and phosphorus requirements. We looked at frequency of applications and sampling or analysis of manure when making the application. So to be considered a high adopter for this, the producer applies manure based on the N and P requirements. So that's the orange bar. But they also have to do one of the following things. They have to put it on once every 2 years or less, or they need to be doing soil tests, tissue tests, or doing the manure compost analysis. So the gate for them to first get through is that they're doing both nitrogen and phosphorus, and it's the other pieces of the puzzle that have to also fit. And so if we do that, 22% of the manure users surveyed are considered high adopters using that criteria. For right source, this one, the team decided that if the producers are using manure, they're going to be given credit for using the right source for the purposes of the 4R calculation. So this one gets an automatic 100% if they're using manure. For right place, we're using incorporation of the solid manure or the application methods of liquid manure. And so this one has another wrinkle because it involves either incorporation or injecting the manure. It can't be producers who are direct seeding all their fields. So if they're applying manure and direct seeding all their fields, they do not be considered as being a high adopter. So it's those that are not direct seeding all their fields that we need to walk through the calculation for. And it's if they do incorporation of their solid manure within 24 hours, or they do the inject or broadcast with incorporation within 24 hours, those people are considered high adopters. So what we get from that is we see that 22% of the manure users surveyed are high adopters for right place using the criteria that we've set up. For right time, it's really that they don't apply to snow or frozen ground that makes it for right time. So if you can see these orange bars are the people who say no, that they do not apply to frozen or snow-covered ground. So if we do that, then 86% of the producers surveyed are considered to be high adopters for right time because they didn't do either the compost or the manure on the snow or frozen ground. So again, like we did with the commercial fertilizer, we'll look at the adoption. For one practice, it's 8%, and this is the freebie practice of using the right source. So what this means is that 8% of the producers aren't doing anything other than using the manure for their right source. If we look at 2 practices, 64% of the producers that use manure would fall into using 2 of the 4R practices. And it really comes down to right source and right time for this one. They're not putting it on in the wintertime generally. For 3 practices, it's down to 18%. And for this one, it's pretty equal between right rate and right place in terms of that third practice that they're adopting. And if we look at 4 practices, 10% of the producers are doing all 4 of the 4R practices when it comes to manure on their operation. So next, we're going to move on to carbon sequestration and emissions reductions. So in this section and the next one about emissions reductions, we're going to be highlighting the practices that Alberta Agriculture and Irrigation have identified based on the questions in the survey that are being done by producers that support carbon sequestration and or emissions reductions. So starting with the carbon sequestration piece, we're going to start by looking at the seeding and cropping choices. And so seeding practices being direct seeding, 56% of the producers were direct seeding the majority of their acres. And the reason why we've included that, and you'll see these blue boxes underneath, kind of gives kind of the intention or the reason why we highlighted this as going into carbon sequestration. So it's minimizing tillage and maintaining the organic matter and the residue. That's what that direct seeding is doing to help carbon sequestration. So for crop types used in the rotation, any of the blue bars that you see there, perennial forages, pulse crops, winter cereals, cover crops, intercrops, we're highlighting those as practices that help increase carbon sequestration. And the reason for that is that including perennials really reduces the field work, the potential for fertilizer application gets reduced, and it increases ground cover and adds legumes into the rotation. So those are all strong practices for carbon sequestration. For manure and fertilizer applications, we've included the 4 bars that you see here, with the liquid manure bar having an extra piece added, that if they're doing liquid manure, it really should be injected or should be incorporated within 24 hours. And so the reasoning behind that is adding manure adds nutrients and organic material and carbon to the soil. So that one's pretty straightforward. Adding fertilizer increases the crop growth, which actually adds carbon that's going to go back into the soil. So livestock grazing decision making is the next category. And what we've done here is we've highlighted the farm practices that they're using around grazing that help with carbon sequestration. And so it's, rotating the pastures as part of your grazing management. 80% of the farmers that have livestock are doing that. Annual consideration to adjust your stocking rates. 2/3 are doing that one. Native grassland, it is the third of the top 3, managing that native grassland with 60%. And so the reasons why we included all these practices is that really anything done to improve the grazing practices improves the plant growth, which in the end improves the carbon sequestration. So that's why those farm practices in particular were picked to highlight and show how carbon sequestration can be helped with these practices. So if we move on to the emissions reduction piece, we're going to start with manure application and timing. So you've seen these charts before as part of the 4R, but looking at it now in terms of how it would reduce emissions. So again, the blue bars are that they are not applying manure to frozen or snow-covered ground, or compost, and then that the 28% are incorporating their manure within 24 hours. Those would all be strong practices that would reduce emissions. And the reason for including that is around the ammonia and nitrous oxide emissions that can happen if you don't incorporate quickly enough or you've put it onto the snow. Continuing on with manure application and timing, we've also looked at liquid manure. And so the injection or the incorporation within 24 hours are also practices that, definitely help with emissions reduction because of that quick incorporation. Sample analysis of manure, I should say, doing that soil test, tissue test to inform a calculator or the manure and compost analysis. Those are 2 practices that the team highlighted. And really the reason behind that is knowing what nutrients you need and making sure that the right rate is used when applying the manure really helps reduce those excess emissions that could happen if you are over applying the manure. Around fertilizer application, the 2 practices that they wanted to really highlight again was the soil and tissue test to inform a calculator, as it relates to fertilizer application, and the previous crop nutrient removal rates, using that as a way to determine your rate that you're going to use. And again, for this one, it's knowing what needs to be applied helps minimize the nutrients and or the runoff that you're putting in, and helping with emissions reductions that way. The next bars are, again, should look familiar. The fertilizer application method used, in-furrow, banded, fertigation, those are the blue bars that the team is highlighting, and or that the applications of fertilizer are happening in the spring or summer. And so the reasons for putting those is applying during those times and getting the fertilizer actually into the soil really helps reduce the losses and emissions that are happening for that. Renewable power was another piece where the team wanted to highlight that this would help emissions, and it's really if producers were adopting these practices, and including renewable energy, it would reduce the carbon footprint that their farm operation has and would be developing based on using traditional energy sources. Land use. So the first one that we wanted to highlight is kind of changes in summer fallow acres. And so the team has said, that they didn't have any summer fallow, or that they've decreased their summer fallow acres, is a good way to help reduce those emissions, because frankly, just, reducing fallow acres will reduce emissions coming from that land. Changing the unimproved acres on their operation. So, did that increase? Did they have more unimproved acres on their operation? And the reason for this inclusion is really not bring unimproved land into production. There's a big initial release when the land is broken, and so if they have increased acres of unimproved acres, that helps with the emissions as well. And then the last one on this slide is around the crops used in their rotation. And so again, the graph should look familiar, but this one we're highlighting perennial forages, pulse crops, cover crops, and intercrops as reasons, as crop options in the rotation that would help reduce emissions, by reducing fertilizer applications. So the last one that we're going to look at is we're going to look at some technology elements and how that can help. And so the use of variable rate technology, of the commercial fertilizer, 8%, it's really manipulating how we apply the fertilizer to really minimize the emissions and avoid the high risk areas, to reduce over application, which would then yield to greater emissions and things like that. So that's one piece of technology that is helping reduce emissions. The other piece is around the fertilizer blends and the use of nitrogen loss efficiency products. And so using custom blends for each crop type, or using custom blends for each crop/field combination, those are both good practices versus just using a regular custom blend across the farm in total, or not using any blend at all. It's just based on the supplier availability. And the use of the nitrogen loss as an always, that they're always using it, again, is another way to inhibit the loss, that's the emissions that are coming from the nitrogen products. So the last piece before we get to the questions and answers period is really around the informational tools. This is the tools that are available to producers, and we just wanted to highlight some of these for your information. So the way we've broken out these tools is we've broken them out into 3 areas. It's access, management, and support are the 3 areas that we broke the tools across. And what we're going to show in these 3 slides is we're looking at a few different measures. So the light blue bar is that the producers have used that particular tool. The light green is that they're aware of the tool, but they haven't used it. And the dark green is that they have not heard of the particular tool. We're also highlighting which of the risk areas would be, impacted by that particular tool, just so you have that as a piece of information when thinking about each of these tools. And so the environmental farm plan, with 41% of the respondents saying they have used the environmental farm plan, that is the highest within this category, but it's also the second highest used tool, only behind the local extension person as the tool, which is the highest one, and I'll show you that one in the coming slides. But so that's one has 41% use. The particular habitat management chapter, 37% use. And you can see that the last one, the Alberta Soil Information Viewer, has a bigger portion of the population that was not aware of that one. So that's a piece to kind of watch out for with that particular tool. So this one is a much busier slide because there's just more management tools, but we wanted to basically get it onto one slide so that you could see the different management tools all up against each other. And so in this particular grouping, the 4R nutrient stewardship principles has the highest use at just over a third. And you can see that it's pretty even, a third, a third, a third for aware, and then those again that have not heard of that particular tool. And it kind of drops off the use, through Alberta Climate, and the Integrated Pest Management and Planning Tool Strategies app, and down you can see that the use of these different ones drops off. Now, some of these tools are very specific. The dugout lagoon volume calculator, that's a very specific tool. And so having a higher not heard of for that particular tool doesn't kind of surprise me. But if there are some tools in here that are more mainline tools and they have a high, haven't heard of it percentage, then that's a watch out point in terms of, that's something where you can grow and, increase the awareness of the tool so that it gets out to more farmers and get some more use happening. If we move on to the last one, which is the resources to support the ESA adoption, like I mentioned, local extension personnel has the highest use at 44% out of all the tools, followed by the Alberta Weed requirements and standards, and then the Alberta Pest Act is the third highest in these particular groupings of tools. And you can see that the bottom one, the Alberta Operations Practice Act, is the one with the least awareness. So again, that's one where, maybe some awareness building might help that particular tool or measure. And that really gets us through all the slides that I wanted to cover for today. So what I'll do is, at this time, I'll open it up for the questions and answer period, and we'll go from there.